Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be continuing our hypertrophy training guidelines, and this one's going to be on the hamstrings muscle group. So we first need to establish the anatomy of the hamstring muscles. So we have 3 hamstring muscles and 4 if we include the adductor magnus, which is actually an adductor muscle, but we'll talk about that in a sec. So we have the biceps femoris. It's called the biceps femoris because it has 2 heads. That's why it has the bi. So it has a short head, which we can sort of see here. And then we have the long head here. So this bigger one here. So the only difference between the short head and the long head is that the long head here flexes the knee, but also it crosses the hip joint, so it actually also extends the hips, which we'll talk about when we get into the movements. Whereas the short head only flexes the knee. So it's just minutiae, nothing to really worry about, but there is a slight difference in the 2 heads in terms of function. Then we have semimembranosus and semitendinosus, which are basically both do the same thing. So here we have the semitendinosus, then we have the semimembranosus here, sort of underneath and a little bit more towards the middle of the body. And they basically both do the same thing. They both cross the hip and they both cross the knee. We then here have the adductor magnus, which we can see here on the outside, which is actually an adductor muscle, but part of those muscle fibers actually act like the hamstring muscles. So they flex the knee and extend the hip also. So the reason that I've included the adductor magnus here is because it acts like a hamstring and it's quite a big muscle here, so it actually will have some influence on physical appearance in terms of hypertrophy. So the movements that the hamstring muscles produce are knee flexion and hip extension. So knee flexion is when basically we have our leg outright, our knee fully straight, and then we bend it towards the bum. That's knee flexion. That's the movement that the hamstring produces when it contracts. The hamstrings also, which is sort of a forgotten movement of the hamstrings, they also perform hip extension. So if we have our leg out straight here, and then we bring our leg, so we're bent at the hip here, then we bring the leg down from the hip, that's hip extension. So if we think about a deadlift or a stiff leg deadlift, when you're coming up, you're hinged at the hips at the bottom, and when you're coming up, you're extending those hips, so those hips are opening up. So that's also what the hamstring, that's another movement the hamstring produces. So a common conception is that squats will work the hamstrings, but they don't really, and this is why. So during a squat, the hip extends and the knee extends at the same time. So if you think about here, we're coming out of a squat, so we're standing up. Those hips are going to extend, so those hips are going to come through and straighten out, but also this knee is going to extend, so that's going to straighten out. And if we remember on this slide, the movements the hamstring produces, it was hip extension, yes, so it does that, but knee flexion. So if we have the opposite action, we have knee extension here. So basically the hamstrings are going to lengthen at the knee. So because it's knee extension, they're not going to shorten, they're going to lengthen. They're actually going to get longer on this end, but they're going to shorten at the hip. So because the hip's extending, they're actually going to shorten on this side. So there's 2 basically opposing actions that the hamstrings are going to produce, which means that they're not really going to be recruited by the nervous system because of these opposing actions. So they're sort of just going to stay the same length the whole time and not really do much. The glutes for sure will be active, quads for sure will be active, but hamstrings, they won't really be active. So I've got this picture of the hamstring's anatomy again, just to reiterate that here it crosses the knee joint, so it performs knee flexion. So if these shorten, the knee is going to close, and if these shorten here, the hip is going to open up. In a squat, the hips open up, but the knee actually extends. So it's going to lengthen at this end here, but it's going to shorten at this end here. So it's not really going to change the length throughout the entire movement. So what exercises are good for the hamstrings? So we have sort of 2 main hamstring exercises which we can do, which are knee flexion exercises and then hip extension exercises. So knee flexion exercises are things like machine hamstring curls, and then also something like Nordics. Now, a good thing to mention here is that exercises like Nordics or exercises that have an eccentric overload on muscles, sort of we have more hypertrophy in series, which means that the fascicle length, so the length of the muscle fibers, actually gets longer. So they're growing in length as opposed to in diameter. So we can have things like machine hamstring curls, which we can do an eccentric overload as well on, Nordics, or if you want, you can do assisted Nordics to get the up and down motion. And then we have hip extension exercises, which are probably going to be more damaging and more effective at growing the hamstrings, just because we can generally use more weight and also get a bigger stretch on the hamstrings. Usually when we're doing knee flexion exercises for the hamstrings, we have the hips in an already extended position, so they're not in a very stretched state. But when we do hip extension exercises, we normally have the knees extended already, and then we're putting extra hip extension in there. So we're really stretching the hamstrings out, which has been shown in itself to actually produce more hypertrophy just from being in a more stretched position under load. So hip extension exercises, stiff leg deadlifts, probably the best one. Back extensions, so we can do them body weight or weighted, ideally weighted. That's going to produce the hip extension as well. And then something like a good morning as well is going to give us that nice hip extension that we're after. The thing with good mornings is you're probably not going to get the same range of motion that you can with like a stiff leg deadlift. So although you can load them fairly heavy, they're probably not quite as effective as a stiff leg deadlift or a back extension. So knee flexion and hip extension exercises. I can think of one, which is a glute ham raise. So basically going down into a back extension and then coming all the way up like you would come up in a Nordic hamstring exercise. So going all the way down on a glute ham machine and then coming all the way up onto the knee. So that would hit the hamstrings both in hip flexion and hip extension. So that would put maximum stretch and then maximum contraction on the hamstrings. So probably quite an effective one, however, probably not the best to load very heavy. So example of some hamstrings programming that we can do. So probably the best way to do it is to have one primary hip extension exercise and then one primary knee flexion exercise. So we could have stiff leg deadlifts and machine hamstring curls throughout the week. One day throughout the week, and then we'll have the same exercises another day throughout the week. So we might hit them 2 times in 1 week, which will pretty much be enough for almost everyone, since the hamstrings are so prone to being stretched under load, and generally people find they get very sore. Stiff leg deadlifts, machine hamstring curls, we'll do around 3 to 5 sets. And this one we're going to do slightly lower reps, so we might go in the 6 rep range in the stiff leg deadlift and the 10 rep range in the hamstring curl, and appropriate loads. Then on the other day we might do slightly higher reps, but also reduce the load slightly, so we get a bit more volume, but it's a bit lower intensity. And the same thing with the machine hamstring curl, drop the weight a little bit, but up the volume a little bit, or work in a higher rep range. So that's it for this presentation, guys. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of it. You can find Flow High Performance on Facebook and on Instagram, where you'll find these research infographics, which are essentially the latest research summarized into these easy to understand pictures, so that you can stay up to date with the latest research in sports performance training without actually having to go into the journals yourself and read the entire article. So thanks for watching, guys. You might want to watch another video here, or you might want to check out our latest video here. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and stay up to date with the next videos in this series of hypertrophy. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you got something out of it.